Are those supposed to be real? The question, laced with the casual disdain of a man who had never known hardship, echoed in the cavernous silence of the courtroom. Judge Albright, a man whose tailored suit cost more than the motorcycle Fred Hudson had ridden here, leaned forward over his polished desk, a smirk playing on his lips. He peered down at the old man standing before him for a simple traffic violation. Fred Hudson, 84 years old, stood perfectly still. His back was straight, a testament to a discipline forged in a time and place this judge could not begin to imagine. He wore a simple faded denim jacket, the kind that had seen decades of sun and rain. Pinned to the left breast, just over his heart, were 3 rows of ribbons in a single star-shaped medal hanging from a pale blue ribbon. They were the source of the judge's amusement. The morning light filtering through the tall windows cast long shadows across the worn wooden floor, and in those shadows stood a man whose silence spoke louder than any words could. His hands, weathered and marked by time, rested calmly at his sides. The courtroom was filled with the usual Monday morning crowd, people clutching traffic citations and parking tickets, their eyes darting nervously between the judge and the clock on the wall. But now every eye was fixed on the elderly veteran and the man who sat in judgment over him, sensing that something far beyond a simple traffic hearing was about to unfold in this small-town courthouse. "Your Honor," Sarah Jenkins began, rising from her chair with a file folder clutched in her trembling hands, "my client's service record has absolutely no bearing on this traffic matter before the court today." Judge Albright waved a dismissive hand in her direction, not even gracing her with the courtesy of eye contact. His gaze remained locked on Fred Hudson, like a predator circling wounded prey. "I'm quite certain it doesn't, Counselor," he drawled, his voice thick with condescension. "I'm simply curious about this rather impressive display. It's quite a collection for a man who apparently can't remember that a red octagon means stop, or that 50 in a 35 zone is illegal. Tell me, Mr. Hudson, did you purchase these at one of those military surplus stores? Perhaps they were having a sale on costume jewelry for impressing the old-timers down at the Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall." The small gallery of spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the wooden benches creaking under the weight of their collective unease. A few nervous laughs rippled from somewhere in the back rows, but most people simply stared, their faces reflecting a mixture of profound embarrassment and dawning horror at what they were witnessing. Fred Hudson remained motionless, offering no response. His eyes, pale gray like storm clouds over distant mountains, were fixed on something beyond the judge, beyond the courtroom walls entirely. He seemed to inhabit 2 worlds simultaneously, present in body but absent in spirit, standing in a place of such profound inner stillness that the judge's words appeared to wash over him like rain on stone. He wasn't angry or insulted or even particularly concerned. He simply was. "I asked you a direct question, sir," the judge pressed, his voice rising with the petulant irritation of a man unaccustomed to being ignored. He leaned forward in his high-backed leather chair, relishing the small-town authority his position afforded him, the power to dissect and humiliate anyone unfortunate enough to stand in his domain. "Are you going to answer me, or are you as deaf as you are decorated? Perhaps those medals are affecting your hearing." "Your Honor, please." Sarah Jenkins stood straighter, her face flushed crimson with barely contained rage. "This is completely inappropriate, and you know it. Mr. Hudson is a decorated veteran of the United States Armed Forces, and he deserves our respect and gratitude, not this public mockery." "Respect is earned, Counselor," Albright snapped back, his words cracking through the air like a whip. "And parading around with a chest full of cheap tin doesn't automatically earn anything in my courtroom, except perhaps my contempt. Now, Mr. Hudson, I'm asking you for the final time, where exactly did you acquire those medals?" Fred's gaze slowly descended from whatever distant point it had been fixed upon and came to rest on the judge's face. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried an unexpected gravity, like ancient stones smoothed by centuries of river water. "They were given to me, sir." The simplicity of his answer seemed to infuriate the judge even further, offering no foothold for continued derision. "Given to you by whom? The costume shop manager? Let me be perfectly clear about something." The judge leaned back, a grotesque caricature of judicial authority, his fingers drumming on the armrest. I am thoroughly tired of men of a certain generation believing that a uniform they wore 50 years ago entitles them to special treatment or exemption from the law. You ran a stop sign at County Road 12. You were clocked at 53 miles per hour in a 35 zone. And you have the audacity to stand here in this ridiculous jacket as if it's some kind of magical shield against consequences. I find it personally insulting to the genuine heroes who actually serve this nation with honor. Each word was a calculated strike designed to wound and diminish. Sarah Jenkins could feel the coiled tension in her own shoulders, her jaw clenched so tightly it ached. She glanced at her client, at those gnarled hands speckled with age spots resting with preternatural calm on the defense table. He didn't fidget or flinch or show even the slightest tremor of emotion. He simply absorbed the judge's poison without reaction, like a cliff face weathering a storm. "Take the jacket off," the judge suddenly commanded. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom like wind through wheat. This was no longer about a traffic violation. This had become a public execution of dignity itself. "Your Honor, you cannot be serious," Sarah pleaded, her voice catching slightly. "I am entirely serious, counselor. This is my courtroom, and the defendant will demonstrate appropriate respect for these proceedings. That garish display is a distraction and an affront to this court's dignity. Remove it, Mr. Hudson, or I will hold you in contempt and add $500 to whatever fine I ultimately impose." The bailiff, a heavy-set man named Torres, who had witnessed countless courtroom dramas, took a hesitant step forward, his eyes meeting Fred's with an expression that seemed almost apologetic. Fred Hudson did not move, did not acknowledge the bailiff's approach or the judge's escalating fury. His eyes drifted down to the medals pinned over his heart, lingering for just a heartbeat on the one suspended from the pale blue ribbon, and in that moment he seemed to be listening to something only he could hear, a voice calling from across decades and oceans. His silence was his answer, profound and absolute and unshakable. "Fine," Judge Albright spat, his face modeling an ugly shade of red. "Bailiff, add contempt of court to the charges and a $500 fine. Perhaps that will penetrate his selective hearing. And especially that one," he continued, jabbing a finger toward the star-shaped medal. "The sheer gall of wearing a replica Medal of Honor. Do you have any concept of what that symbol represents, old man? The blood and sacrifice and courage it embodies? You wearing that fraudulent piece of tin is a slap across the face of every man and woman who ever served this country with genuine honor." As the judge's venomous words echoed through the sterile courtroom, something shifted in Fred Hudson's consciousness. The polished wood panels and fluorescent lights began to dissolve, replaced by a different reality entirely. The judge's mocking voice faded into a different roar, not of an angry magistrate, but of helicopter rotors beating the humid air and men screaming in agony and terror. The smell of floor wax and stale coffee vanished, overwhelmed by the metallic stench of fresh blood and the acrid bite of cordite smoke hanging thick in the jungle heat. For one suspended moment outside of time, he was no longer standing on worn linoleum in a county courthouse, but was back in the sucking red mud of a rice paddy on the outskirts of Hughes City. He wasn't looking at a judge's sneering, contemptuous face, but into the terrified, pain-glazed eyes of Private James Miller from Akron, Ohio, a kid who collected baseball cards and wrote letters to his girlfriend every single day, whose left leg had been nearly severed by enemy machine gun fire. The pale blue of the medal's ribbon transformed into the impossible, brilliant blue of sky glimpsed through breaks in the jungle canopy in those final seconds before he'd launched himself from the relative safety of a bomb crater. He could feel it all again with visceral clarity. Miller's weight across his shoulders, the hot wetness of blood soaking through his fatigues, the deafening staccato of enemy guns stitching deadly patterns in the mud mere inches from his head as he ran. His lungs had burned like fire, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might explode. But there had been only one thought in his mind, singular and desperate and all-consuming. Get this boy to the medevac bird. Get him home to his mother. Don't let him die here in this godforsaken mud. The medal wasn't tin or bronze or any metal at all. It was the crushing weight of another human life carried across 200 meters of hell. The memory released him as suddenly as it had seized him, and Fred Hudson found himself back in the silent, tension-filled courtroom. He blinked slowly, his iron composure intact, though his breathing had changed almost imperceptibly, becoming deeper and more measured. Sarah Jenkins had been watching the entire exchange with mounting horror and helpless fury. She saw the judge's casual cruelty, the gallery's cowed silence, and Fred's almost supernatural composure. And she knew with bone-deep certainty that she was witnessing a terrible injustice, that this judge was desecrating something sacred he couldn't begin to comprehend. She looked down at the intake file before her. Fred Hudson, widower, a handful of minor speeding citations spread across 2 decades, nothing else of note. In the box labeled military service, Fred had simply written the word yes in neat, careful handwriting. He hadn't specified a branch or rank or unit or any decorations whatsoever. The profound humility of that single word in the face of this public flogging took her breath away. Then her eyes caught on something else, a small detail she'd overlooked before, a simple pin on Fred's jacket collar, a miniature crest she didn't recognize. An idea sparked in her mind, desperate and unlikely, but perhaps their only hope. "Your Honor," she said carefully, rising to her feet, "I need to step out briefly to retrieve an additional file from my office that may be relevant to these proceedings." Judge Albright waved her away with obvious disinterest, already composing his next verbal assault. "Do whatever you wish, counselor. Your client isn't going anywhere, and frankly, neither is this hearing until I receive satisfactory answers." Sarah practically fled the courtroom, her heels clicking an urgent rhythm on the polished hallway floors. She ducked into an empty alcove, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone. She didn't have any file to retrieve. What she had was that pin. Her fingers flew across the screen. U.S. Army crest soared behind Castle Tower. The search results flooded her screen instantly. First Special Forces Group, the Green Berets. Her breath caught in her throat as the implications crashed over her. This was something else entirely. Something far beyond a simple traffic court appearance. She scrolled, frantically, searching for any contact information, any connection to the military establishment that might help. She found a general number for Fort Lewis in Washington State, the first group's headquarters. It was a wild gamble, a shot fired blindly into the dark, but she had nothing else. A bored-sounding specialist answered on the 4th ring. "Fort Lewis Public Affairs, how may I direct your call?" "My name is Sarah Jenkins," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady and professional. "I'm a public defender in Northwood County, and I have a client here, an elderly veteran who's in serious trouble." "Ma'am, we generally can't involve ourselves in civilian legal matters," the specialist replied, his tone flat and rehearsed. "I understand that completely, but please just listen. His name is Fred Hudson. He's being held in contempt of court right now because the presiding judge doesn't believe his service medals are authentic and is publicly humiliating him." "Ma'am, I really can't." "He's wearing a 1st Special Forces Group pin," she interrupted desperately, playing her final card. "Please, his name is Fred Hudson, Hudson, first name Fred." There was a pause on the other end of the line. The bored, bureaucratic tone evaporated instantly, replaced by a sharp, focused silence that made the hair on her arms stand up. The sound of rapid typing came through the phone, then a sharp intake of breath. When the specialist spoke again, his voice was completely transformed, crisp and urgent and filled with barely contained energy. "Ma'am, what courtroom are you in right now?" "Courtroom C, Northwood County Courthouse," she stammered, hope suddenly blazing in her chest. "Do not let your client leave that courtroom. Do not allow them to take him anywhere. We are on our way." The line went dead. Sarah stood frozen in the alcove, phone still pressed to her ear, the specialist's final words echoing in the sudden silence. "We are on our way." The phone call ended in Washington State, but the shockwave it created moved at the speed of lightning through military channels. The specialist didn't hesitate, didn't follow protocol or chain of command. He patched the call directly to the office of the base commanding officer, a battle-hardened colonel who'd served 3 tours in Iraq. The colonel listened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his desk. The moment he heard the name Fred Hudson spoken aloud, he was out of his chair and moving. He strode down the hall to a larger, more imposing suite of offices and entered without knocking. Inside, General Marcus Thorne was reviewing quarterly logistics reports. He was a man who looked carved from granite and determination, 3 stars gleaming on his shoulders, a gaze that could strip paint from walls. He glanced up, annoyed at the intrusion. "Sir," the colonel said, slightly out of breath, "we have a Code Nightingale situation." The general's eyes sharpened instantly. Code Nightingale was an unofficial, unwritten protocol reserved for a handful of living legends, men whose service was so extraordinary that the institution itself was honor-bound to protect them regardless of circumstance. It hadn't been invoked in over a decade. "Who?" the general asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "Sergeant Major Fred Hudson, sir," the colonel replied. "He's being held in contempt in a civilian courthouse. A local judge is accusing him of wearing fake medals. Specifically, sir, the Medal of Honor." General Marcus Thorne was moving before the colonel finished speaking, the logistics reports scattering forgotten across his desk. "Where is he?" "Northwood County Courthouse, approximately 90 minutes from here by helicopter." "Get me a bird in the air in 10 minutes and a car waiting at the nearest airfield," the general commanded. "Full honor guard, dress uniforms. I want to be standing in that courtroom within the hour." Back in courtroom C, the air had grown thick and stagnant with Judge Albright's self-satisfaction. He was preparing to deliver his final crushing blow to the silent old man before him. "Given your refusal to comply with direct orders from this court and your apparent delusional state regarding your military service, I am not only holding you in contempt, but I am also deeply concerned about your mental fitness to function in society. Therefore, I am ordering a mandatory 72-hour psychiatric evaluation. The bailiff will remand you into custody for immediate transport to the state hospital." This was the ultimate degradation, a public declaration that Fred Hudson was insane, that his entire life and service were the fabrications of a broken mind. Judge Albright raised his gavel high, preparing to bring it down with theatrical finality. He never got the chance. A commotion erupted from the hallway outside. The heavy oak courtroom door burst open with such force they slammed against the walls. 2 soldiers in immaculate army dress blues entered with synchronized precision, taking positions on either side of the entrance and standing at perfect parade rest. The courtroom fell into stunned, absolute silence. Then a third figure entered. General Marcus Thorne was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark green uniform pressed to razor-sharp perfection, rows of ribbons across his chest, 3 silver stars gleaming on each shoulder. He didn't glance at the judge or the gallery. His sharp eyes scanned the room and until they found their target, and he began walking down the center aisle, his polished boots striking the floor with the sound of measured, deliberate judgment. Each step was an indictment. Each step shifted the balance of power so profoundly the air itself seemed to change. He stopped directly before the defense table, less than 3 feet from Fred Hudson. For a long moment, the 2 men simply looked at each other, a universe of shared understanding passing between them in that silent exchange. Then General Marcus Thorne snapped to the sharpest, most perfect position of attention anyone in that room had ever witnessed and brought his hand up in a salute so crisp and precise it seemed to cut the very air. "Sergeant Major Hudson," his voice boomed, filling every corner of the silent courtroom, "it is an honor to be in your presence, sir."